Welcome to the Great War discussion group. Our speaker is our volunteer manager, Kristen Keckler-Alexander, who is, as you can see from the screen, talking about some activities back here, the Military Sisterhood of America. World War I was unique and started a major trend in American society, which was support for the people that are left back at home. Not only the families of military people who are serving in the military, but many other aspects of supporting the military by supporting the people that they left behind. We never did that before. We didn't do it in the Spanish-American War. We didn't do it in the Civil War, but we did in this war, and that trend has continued to this very day. I think it's something that it deserves looking at, and Kristin wound up doing a master's thesis on one aspect of that, and that's the work that underlies what she is going to talk about today. Kristin, you are on.
Hello, everybody. I am Kristen Keckler-Alexander. I'm the volunteer program manager here at the National World War I Museum and Memorial. But once upon a time, I was a graduate student in a history program and also interning at the Kansas State Historical Society. And I stumbled across this box of correspondence that hadn't been worked since the 80s. And as I was going through it and working on updating the catalog and modernizing their cataloging, I became fascinated by the story that I kind of stumbled into. And it resonated really heavily with me because, as many of you know, I grew up a military kid. I was born, my parents were both active duty when I was born. And so I have spent almost 41 years being a military dependent in one way or another. As an adult, I went on a blind date with a guy, didn't check the haircut, wound up a military wife. So military family life is something that's been a central focus in me. And the story that I stumbled upon that I'm going to tell you about talks about kind of the time before and how things and systems that I kind of take for granted didn't exist, and how these families had to grassroots a lot of these programs. It was a really fascinating story, and then it turned out that the woman who was leading the entire thing was an incredibly fascinating person, so I'll tell you a little bit more about her. So that's kind of our introduction. So here on the agenda, I just kind of went through and bullet pointed some of the main points that I'm going to hit. So we've done the introduction to the topic. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Charles and Lou-Ida Martin, who are two central figures to this. Charles Martin was, of course, in the military, and his wife, Lou-Ida Martin, who actually went by Ida Martin. She apparently really didn't like her first name. And then we'll talk about a little bit of the historical context so you kind of understand what pre-World War, or immediately pre-World War home front looked like for military families. And then we'll have a brief detour where I'm going to do some anthropology for you guys, just kind of going over briefly what culture and subculture and why that is relevant to this topic. And then we'll talk about the military sisterhood, how it formed, expanded, and then its lasting legacy, even into modern times. So, moving forward, Charles I. Martin and Lou-Ida Ward Martin. Now, Charles Martin was, during World War I, he was a brigadier general, but once upon a time, he was actually born in Illinois, and his family moved to Kansas when he was 3. So he spent most of his life in Kansas. He actually graduated from the Fort Scott Normal School and was a teacher for I want to say 8 terms before he went to law school. He also, during this time, enlisted in the Kansas National Guard in, I believe, 1890 was his enlistment date. And then in between different operations, he served during border operations. He also served in the Spanish-American War. And then he also went to KU Law School. You'll notice that his date at KU is 1907. He and his wife actually were in the same law school class. They went to law school together. And she actually graduated law school several points ahead of him. She beat most of the men in her class in her law school scores. So soon to be General Martin, then I believe he was Lieutenant and Captain Martin, served in the Mexican Revolution and the Spanish-American War. In the Spanish-American War, he actually took his company to San Francisco, and Ida actually went along with them, serving in a company mother capacity while they were training in San Francisco until they shipped out to the Philippines. And then they shipped out to the Philippines and saw conflict there. Then in World War I, he was serving as the adjunct general of the Kansas National Guard, and he wound up taking troops overseas. And then after the war, he came back to Fort Scott, where his wife had been not only raising their child and running this organization, but also keeping their law practice running, because they were partners in Martin and Martin and Fort Scott. And when he returned to Fort Scott, he became a clerk of the district court, and then eventually he wound up serving in the Kansas State Senate. In the 1920s, I want to say it was 26, he was appointed to serve as the director for what would become the Dwight D. Eisenhower VA home up in Leavenworth. At that time, it had a different name. And he served there for several years, and he died in 1953 in Cheyenne, Wyoming. He actually went up to Wyoming because that's his daughter got married and moved up there. So he went up there for the end of his life. So that's a little bit about Charles Martin. He also has very nice penmanship. This is Lou Ida Ward Martin, more commonly known as Ida Martin. She was born in Bourbon County, Kansas, and she spent most of her life, she was a Christmas baby, spent most of her life here in Kansas. Ida was married to Charles in 1894, and she also graduated from the Fort Scott Normal School. That's where they met. And then they both went to law school at KU. They were in the law school class of 1907. Funny enough, at that time, their daughter Lillian was actually in grade school. So in addition to both of them being in law school, they were also raising a grade schooler. She is believed to be the second woman to have taken the state bar exam in the state of Kansas. She was actually admitted to the bar also in 1907, and then she was admitted to practice law before the Supreme Court in 1922. All of this takes place under the context of the fact that women did not actually have the national right of suffrage yet at this point, and she was a practicing lawyer and a full partner in a law firm in 1907. So she was a pretty remarkable woman for her time and an incredibly smart woman by all accounts. One of her greatest achievements actually came a little bit later. So in 1924, she was actually appointed. It is alleged that she is the first woman that was appointed to serve as an assistant attorney general. There is a competing story from a earlier frontier era female lawyer. But according to the Historical Society, she was the first woman that was appointed to this position. She was appointed by the then Attorney General, who was C.B. Griffith. Predominantly, his argument was that they needed female lawyers to oversee domestic cases. and cases involving children, but still a fairly remarkable accomplishment for a female lawyer at that time. And she was a powerhouse in her own right. So her role prior to World War One, this is just some more background information, was sort of three parts. And for those of you who have served in the military and have had spouses be in these roles, you'll know that one person is often all of these things all rolled up into one. But she was sort of the company mother. She traveled with her husband's company to San Francisco during the Spanish-American conflict. She served as a confidant and an advisor to soldiers. She took on board what their concerns were. Several soldiers expressed anxiety about their family's financial stability when they were absent because their military pay was oftentimes lower than what they could be earning in the civilian world. Many young men worried about families managing farms without them there to help. So even though most of these young men were not married, most of them could not be married at that time and still be serving. They still had families that they were oftentimes primary breadwinners for or main breadwinners for. And oftentimes National Guard pay was delayed. Pay did not come on time. And so they also were deeply concerned about that. And so she kind of became a conduit she took on board their concerns, and she assured them that while they were gone, she would be home. And if any families had these problems, to please come to her, and she would work with them to try to solve these issues. So she kind of fell into the role of confidant, mediator, and assistance, all rolled into one. She also helped soldiers manage their pay, as young soldiers often are not great at. And she worked with them on communication. There were actually a couple young men in the company that could not write very well. And she took on the role of writing letters for them to send to their families before they shipped out. So that was some of the roles that she filled in, and that actually shaped a lot of why she pursued this organization. So her role when she came back home after the company shipped out to the Philippines was she fell into visiting the families, checking in on families on the regular. She also maintained regular correspondence with Charles. A lot of those letters did survive and are in the archive there at the Kansas State Historical Society. She would write to him if a family was having troubles or was struggling with something. And so having that constant feedback between her and the captain of their company reassured both the soldiers and the families that issues were being communicated and resolved. She also organized a lot of community efforts to provide resources for families if there were dire instances, fires, floods, tornadoes. She did a lot of grassroots work during that time. And this really shaped the concerns that she had moving forward, because she had this vision that she wrote to her husband about. Is she wanted to see an organization that spawned military wide for families to have these resources, because she wrote about how she was concerned. She knew her husband's company soldiers were taken care of because she was doing it, but who was taking care of other soldiers and who was taking care of those families? And did those families know who they could contact? And so it revealed to her how much comfort it brought to not only the families, but the soldiers themselves. The stress levels that, her husband talked about, how relieved his soldiers were because they knew that Miss Ida would take care of their families and they didn't have to worry about what was happening back home. And so she had this vision that all soldiers could have access to something of this nature. But at the time, it really was not it really wasn't something that was moving forward because, in terms of historical context, around 1917, the American Army was a little over 300,000 strong, and most of that was actually a small standing regular Army and National Guards members. So, as most of you are well aware, the American military pre-World War I was a completely different animal than it was post-World War I in terms of troop numbers, in terms of structure, in terms of organization capacity. There were some pretty critical challenges. I will go over them very briefly, but this group absolutely does not need me to tell you guys a lot of this information. But there was a lot of we didn't have great stockpiles, outdated equipment. Also, both the Mexican Revolution and the Spanish-American War kind of highlighted that we had some shortcomings in terms of major engagement and battle tactics. None of that was really Ida's field of concern. However, her concern was when they made this call out for troops to go overseas, they were asking for numbers that we had never mobilized before. And historically, the military establishment did not prioritize addressing the needs and challenges of service member families because at that time, most soldiers were not actually allowed to be married with families. There were some situations where it was acceptable, but most enlisted men weren't allowed to be married. That changed, obviously, because you can't enlist a 1,000,000-man army and have only 1,000,000 unmarried men. We didn't have that many running around. So, but with that call and that need for such an increase in troops also came families. It came dependents, and that was something the military had never had to address, and so they didn't have any systems actively in place. Also, adding complication to this entire mobilization is not only are you trying to mobilize millions of troops, assemble stockpiles, ship troops overseas, you've got families, and then you've also got the influenza outbreak, which hampered a lot of the support elements that the Red Cross was trying to mobilize to address some of these family issues. The Red Cross got not diverted, but their focus was here in the Midwest was primarily diverted by influenza. So all of that kind of started spinning and boiling, and Ida revised the plan that she thought of during the later days of the Spanish-American War and saying that we need a bigger organization. So really quick, I'm going to take a quick diversion. As some of you may already know, my previous career was more on the anthropology side than the history side, and that's another reason why I find this topic super fascinating. So it's important for people who have not been part of the military system to understand what we're talking about in terms of unique needs requiring cultural insiders to address. And that's part of why the military sisterhood was so successful. So, broad overview, the concept of culture, as you can see, the definition of culture is here on the screen. I'm not going to read all of that off to you, but essentially, you have a primary culture, sometimes called a parent culture. And then occasionally you will have subcultures or cultural enclaves within that culture. Another element oftentimes is the counterculture, which is true cultural outsiders to the parent culture that they exist within. The important thing to remember is when you talk about primary culture and subculture is that while subcultures are part of the primary culture that they are a part of, they oftentimes have slightly different norms, behaviors that coexist harmoniously with their parent culture, but mean that understanding some of the needs of the subculture group, oftentimes the primary culture, people in the primary culture that don't have exposure to subculture normatives, they will struggle to understand, or they may not know how to address it in a way that actually works for the group. Another great example of this is anybody who's worked with ethnic enclave groups. Sometimes there are food traditions, or there are, different behaviors or different religious traditions that we may not necessarily understand. We're trying to respect, but we don't have the framework for it because we're not part of that subculture. So this is part of why the military sisterhood was so successful, because the military is actually defined after several decades of research. Anthropologists, sociologists, and psychologists have all clearly stated that people that are part of the military system are actually a distinct subculture. We have our own normatives, values, and behaviors that, while we fit well within the American parent culture, we are a distinct subculture in society. So another great example of this is the phrase military justice is to civilian justice as music is to military, or as military music is to music. Similar thinking and mindset. We have some different rules and regulations and behaviors that civilians may not necessarily understand. And because of those unique needs, we have distinct needs that need to be met, usually best and most efficiently by cultural insiders. So people that are part of the system are best suited to develop and build the systems to address those needs. Some of the distinct needs that were identified in various different sources, and also in some of Ida's writings, were that military families often don't get access to resources as easily, and that civilians often misinterpret or misunderstand what families are talking about or asking about. So there were many reasons why a cultural insider needed. So unique needs need insider solutions, and the women that formed the Military Sisterhood of America were all, for the most part, cultural insiders. In fact, it was actually a part of the original bylaws that in order to be eligible for membership, you had to be a mother, wife, sister, or daughter of a service member. And that was established initially to ensure that membership was kept within the military community. Their shared experiences helped build this sense of community, and that we are taking care of our own, and that we are working towards getting through this together as a team. And for many of you who have been part of the military system in the past, it probably is all starting to sound very familiar. You've probably had exposure to something called a family readiness group or a family support group that is sounding very familiar. So, the military sisterhood is the idea that spawned from Ida's musings and writings. So, in June of 1917, she gathered a group of women together. She actually got office space in Memorial Hall in Topeka. There was a very funny anecdote. Apparently, the draft board tried to take their office space. She went head to head with the draft board so that they could maintain their office space in Memorial Hall. And they met with the intent to establish this organization, and they did. That day, they signed incorporation documents and filed them for the Military Sisterhood of Kansas. Now, the Military Sisterhood of Kansas was the original name. It eventually will change. And it was established to be a cohesive support system that was specifically there to meet the needs of military families so that soldiers could go to war without having to worry about what was happening back home. They laid out very obviously, Ida, being a lawyer, was very precise and laid out very specific incorporation documents. I believe the initial charter that they wrote up was something like 16 pages, handwritten. of rules and regulations that they established in that meeting for who was eligible for membership, but also for what their mission and their goals were. Eventually, this organization is viewed by several different organizations as a progenitor organization for a lot of modern military support, family support organizations. And as we go through, you'll see a little bit more. So I am absolutely not going to read all of this to you because most of you guys can probably read faster than I can talk. But initially, the primary activity that they undertook, at least in the beginning stages, was they worked a lot on what they called housewives, which were those little sewing kits that they made for soldiers to take with them. That was their first major initiative, and it remained a landmark or a hallmark initiative that they continued on with. But obviously, this is about the time that they are mobilizing and pushing troops out. So they focused a little bit more on getting soldiers gone, and then their activities grew as soldiers left and as the needs demanded. Other areas that they eventually expanded to, they established a network of lawyers, first in the state of Kansas and eventually spreading out into several neighboring states that all agreed, different bar associations all committed to providing free legal services to military families. They established a visiting committee. Each chapter maintained a visiting committee. So there was women that would travel not only for sick relatives, but also for newborns. And that obviously is going to sound very familiar to many people that are part of the military system. They also focused on reunification and helping families after soldiers came home. The organization grew very rapidly. So by 1918, Alice Wilson, who actually lost two sons in World War I, but at that time, both of her sons were still living, established the first chapter over in Missouri. And she wound up establishing not only several other chapters within the state of Missouri, she is also credited with spreading the organization to both Iowa and Oklahoma. They also began spreading not just within Missouri, Iowa, and Oklahoma, but they spread to Colorado. And I believe 3 chapters were chartered in Oklahoma. Part of the reason why we don't actually have an accurate counting of how many chapters were actually established is we do have the national convention that occurred in 1918, and we do have the charter from that talks about which chapters came to the national convention. However, after that, they were not able to organize another national convention to get everybody together. So another element to this is that at that time, for those of you who are very familiar with Army regulations or military regulations, you will remember that it wasn't actually until, I believe, 1987 that it was officially struck down that the conduct and behavior of families could be listed on people's evaluations and reports. So if a family was having financial hardships, even if it wasn't something that they necessarily were responsible for, even if it was just bad luck, if a commander wanted to, they could write that down and it could bar somebody from promotion. It could bar somebody from assignments. And so one of the things that the Military Sisterhood did is they were very cognizant of the fact that families aren't going to ask for help, financial, legal, or any kind of help, if they are afraid that it's going to harm their soldier's career. So they intentionally kept records in very vague manners, and actually some of the chapters coded their records, so they're not really readable. They were readable by obviously the chapter members, but there's one book in the state archive that it's all symbols, and we're just guessing, trying to figure out what they were actually writing about. So they were very smart women in that they understood that in order to give these families the assurance that they are providing resources to them in a way that will not potentially impact them negatively down the road, they developed this policy of anonymity in a lot of their dealings, which I think was incredibly forethinking of these ladies. All right. So you have the financial aid and support initiatives. There were several instances in some of the letters. While we don't have specifics on who received what or even how much individuals received, there were a few small loans that were listed as like $10 loans. No names were given. However, a loan of $10 in 1917 represented almost a third of the monthly pay for the average soldier, enlisted soldier. And for those of you who are curious, that translates to about $245 in today's dollars. So while they were not necessarily huge loans, they had to apply for, if they needed a financial assistance, the women of the military sisterhood, they paid a small amount of dues into a pot, and that pot of money was how they loaned families money. So for those of you, again, that are familiar with the military system, that sounds a lot like the AER program, where you have free borrowing capability or lowered interest rate borrowing capability. Many of these loans were written down as loans. However, there was no interest and no repayment ever documented. So they may have listed them as loans, but they may have actually been gifts. We're not 100% sure. We also have the legal assistance arm, which of course Ida spearheaded. She took it upon herself to start sending out circular letters. And interestingly enough, as I was going through these files and being more and more fascinated by how much it sounded exactly like the Army community service system that we currently have, I stumbled across this letter from the then president of the Wyandotte County Bar Association, who happens to have been my great-great-grandfather. And he apparently had known her. He was also a lawyer here in Kansas. And he had known her, and he had written to pledge Wyandotte County's support for her initiative. But it was just a very interesting through the looking glass moment of, oh my goodness, this is a very small world indeed. There was the compassionate support for the ill. That also included the newborn group. And then they did a lot of active community engagement and outreach. And they also helped the Red Cross during the influenza outbreak because the Red Cross was overwhelmed by the sheer amount of need that happened during the influenza outbreak. So they provided crucial care and support, not only to soldiers, but also to family members that were afflicted. It's a very well devised program that evolved very naturally. And for those of you who are familiar with the military system, it should be sounding pretty familiar to a lot of the systems that we have currently. The impact that we have, a lot of it is anecdotal because simply put, we don't have specific records or testimonial. But we do know from some letters that were received that they played a pivotal role for a lot of these families. Not only did they support the families and make the families feel heard and understood and cared for, they helped the soldiers know that they did not have to worry not only about what was happening on the battlefield, they didn't have to worry about what was happening at home. It gave soldiers a greater peace of mind because they knew that there was an organization that had sprung up to take care of their friends and of their families. Ida Martin was very passionate about the principle of this is justice, not charity. And that was something that she stressed in many of her letters. She also called it giving people their just due. She was very adamant that military families receive assistance without any judgment and with dignity and respect. that families that needed financial assistance were not getting charity from the military sisterhood. They were getting what they needed, and they would, in theory, pay it back and pay it forward to the next family that needed it. She was a very big believer in the community taking care of itself. And her foundational efforts that formed the military sisterhood after the National Convention. That's when their name changed to the Military Sisterhood of America, obviously, because they had spread to several other states. It is listed as a significant influence in developing later programs that you would come to know as Army Community Service, the Family Support Readiness Group, the Army Emergency Relief Fund. A lot of those organizations actually were formalized in the World War II era. And as a side note, the colonel who is credited as the mother of Army Community Service was actually a little girl in Kansas during World War I. And her mother was a charter member of one of the military sisterhood chapters. So we have documented evidence that shows that a lot of these organization ideas were progenitor, or this is a progenitor organization for a lot of these. The Kansas American Legion actually officially classes them as a progenitor organization for the American Legion Auxiliary. So I believe it was 1919, the American Legion had decided that they needed to form a women's auxiliary or a ladies' auxiliary organization, and several different organizations across the nation applied to be the auxiliary for the American Legion, which is why the American Legion ultimately didn't select any of them and chose to form their own auxiliary as it was. But the Military Sisterhood was one of those organizations. It was through the records of that voting process and that application process that I was able to find that there were organizations in Kentucky that were very similar to the Military Sisterhood that sprung up. They were not necessarily as big or as developed, but there were organizations in Kentucky. There were 2 organizations, I believe, out in California. So there were organizations that were springing up all over the place. Now, closer on the East Coast, the Red Cross was actually doing a lot of these things instead of these grassroots organizations that sprung up, because the Red Cross wasn't as burdened there on the East Coast by the influenza outbreak as they were here in the Midwest. But it's just a very interesting way to see how, while this is a great idea and it's a wonderful idea and it was very well thought out and planned, it was also being done and replicated in several different areas because lots of people were recognizing that this is a bigger issue than just a few soldiers going over to the border. So the enduring legacy of the sisterhood, like I said, is that they did play this vital role. They are recognized and documented, but also their enduring legacy is a legacy of the community takes care of itself. And I think that this is a lesson that we've seen over and over again, not just in military organizations, but in any type of community service. Grassroots operations oftentimes produce some of the best results because no one knows better what a community needs than the members of that community. And this group of very motivated women got together and said, we need to take care of one another and ride out the storm the best way we know how. So, closing out with this is I put one of my favorite Helen Keller quotes there, which is, alone we can do so little and together we can do so much. And I feel like the military sisterhood really embodied and embraced that mentality of we are stronger and better as a community when we are together and united and working towards common goals. I think it's really wonderful and inspirational to see that there were women who were doing a lot of the same things that I did during the War on Terror. I went to, can't tell you how many hospital births or dropping supplies off to families when they had a crisis. I did a lot of these different organizations, obviously through the more formalized system that the Army runs. But it was really neat to stumble across this organization of women that were doing this entirely on their own, just the same way that I had to. So, okay, we have about 20 minutes left for questions. What would you guys like to know about?
Kristen,
Anyone?
thank you for all of that. What are the primary successor? Let me rephrase that. After the war, a number of organizations coalesced into what we have now. You mentioned the American Legion, which is primarily a veterans organization, but do they do family support as well?
So, what the women of the military sisterhood did, we don't have an official dissolution date on the sisterhood. They dissolved somewhere between 1922 and 1924, but there are no official meeting minutes, at least none in the file that I have, that go beyond 1920. So it seems like after the armistice was signed and the majority of troops came home, they dissolved. A lot of the women either joined the American Legion Auxiliary. I don't know how much support they do currently. I know at the time they did a lot more. The American Legion Auxiliary did a lot more support for families, but they kind of moved, as Charlie mentioned, they moved more heavily towards veteran support. For organizations that were more family oriented, you had the Gold Star Mothers. Several of them moved over to the Kansas Red Cross and the War Mothers of America. So they did a lot of War Mothers of America and Gold Star Mothers did predominantly work for families of soldiers that passed, but the Kansas Red Cross did a lot more community support organizations. Mike asks if I could expand upon how their efforts in World War I were expanded during World War II. So the short answer, Mike, is that the Military Sisterhood of America did not reform during World War II. A lot of the women that participated in that, as I said, folded into other organizations. Now, what came out of World War II was actually the formalization of what is known as Army Community Service, and then other branches, of course, started their own community service organization. Now, under the Army Community Service umbrella, of course, you've got a whole host of different support resources for families. So you've got, of course, the family support element, you've got the counseling elements, you've got the different resource, both employment readiness, pretty much any community support resource one can imagine, and actually several that you might not think of are encompassed under the Army Community Service umbrella. So that is kind of the transition point, but it's also why it was frustrating working on this topic, because I was trying to draw a clear, bright line between the two. And the problem is that because there was never an official dissolution, I have member names of people that were part of this organization and went on to be part of the early forms of Army Community Service. But I don't have a clear A to A comparison or line that I can draw yet. But if Fort Knox will let me get access to the archive, I'm hoping I can find it.
Kristen, thank you very much. This has been very illuminating.